So, in our third week of our series through the Gospel of Mark, entitled Mark, Son of God, Suffering Servant. Each week, as we go through the Gospel of Mark together, we're going to be looking at more or less one story from each chapter that reveals to us the identity of Christ. And then we're going to talk about why that matters. Mark is a very quickly moving gospel, and so today we're going to look at two stories separated by a modern chapter heading, and that are tied together around this idea that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so we'll be in Mark 2:23 through 3:6. It's a big passage, so it's not going to be on the screen, but as we unpack the verses, they'll be up there. If you like to follow along in your Bible, I'll give you a moment to get there to Mark 2, starting in verse 23. And as you get there, I'll tell you a story. As a lot of you know, I grew up in Danville, Illinois. That's where most of my immediate family still lives. It's on the other side of the state, basically straight up 74 across the state. But Katie and I, when we first got married, we lived in Mahomet, Illinois, which is just outside of Champaign. And so when we would have family events, we'd have about a 45-minute drive. 45-minute drive is not too bad. We'd go there, we'd come back. And then we were called here, and now we're 2.5 hours away. And then we had a baby. And so then things got a little fuzzy with family get-togethers. They would say, hey, we're doing this. And we would say, cool, come to us, or meet us halfway, or let's figure out some things here. And so we hosted my family, and then it came time this last December to figure out what we were going to do. And we said, hey, we got the space, we'd love to host you again. They said, yeah, that's great, but we would love for you to come here. And so then Katie and I started having a conversation about, like, it's 5 hours in the car, we want to do that. Say I'm gonna agree with that much time in the car. What's this going to be? And the logic that kept running through my brain was that Christmas isn't a time for traveling. It's a set apart day. It's a time for family. It's a time for gifts. It's a time for celebrating Jesus. It's a time for all of these things. And so we would say, like, oh man, like if we could meet somewhere in the middle, is it 2 hours of a drive, 3 hours of a drive, 5 hours of a drive? I was looking for some sort of magical, invisible line that would make it work for me. Today, as we unpack these stories about the Sabbath, we're going to talk about these invisible lines that we place upon rest and upon helping people that miss the point of all of that. We drove the 5 hours on Christmas Day because we got to spend time with my brother and sister and nieces and nephews and my parents, and it was a time of family and a time of fellowship and also a time of traveling. And so we're going to talk about kind of some of these invisible lines, these extra teachings that we put on top that miss the point. And so our passage for this morning, Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 23. On Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? He answered, have you never read what David did when him and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled, or your translation might say withered, hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This is our main passage for the morning that we're going to break down together, and it's important to remember when we read our Bibles that the chapter and verse titles, all those they're added in later. So why did they decide to have a chapter break right in between two stories that are very clearly linked to each other? I don't know. But we do know these two stories are linked to each other. They're put in order by the writer of Mark, probably not because they happened in sequential order, but because they are linked in theme. And so Jesus and his disciples, they are walking through the field. As we talked about before, he was not a teacher who sat in a school or sat in a set building and people came to him. He roamed amongst the people. He traveled town to town. And so as they're walking along the road, verses 23 and 24 tell us that they began to pick some heads of grain. Now, it is in Jewish custom and Jewish law to not harvest the grain right along the road for travelers, for poor people, for foreigners. Imagine, if you will, if we said in the state of Illinois, if you farm corn, the first 4 rows closest to the road, don't touch those. Because if somebody's traveling, they can grab an ear of corn as they want as they go down the road. We might think that's crazy, but hospitality is so deeply baked into the Jewish law, the law that God gave them, that they were meant to not harvest the wheat along the road that travelers and foreigners and people who are destitute might eat. And so they're traveling. And as they're traveling, and probably as Jesus is talking while they're walking, they're grabbing bits of grain, heads of grain, and they're eating as they're going, just as they're walking. And these Pharisees who are following behind him, because now they're following Jesus all the time, not because they're interested in what he's saying, but because they're trying to get him to slip up. They say to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" So our first question is, what is the Sabbath? And then we'll get to why they thought it was unlawful, what they were doing. You've probably heard the word Sabbath. You probably have heard lots of ideas about Sabbath, maybe even which day of the week it is or is not on, or what you are or not supposed to do on Sabbath. But we get instruction directly from the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. It says this: "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea, and all of the things in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So we remember from the creation story that God made the world in 6 days. On the 7th day, he rested, and they call this the Sabbath day. The most literal definition of the word Sabbath is to cease. It's to stop, right? You cease working. You take a break. And it's said to be made holy. The word holy means separated for God's purposes. So it's special. It's a little bit different from the rest of the days. I remember growing up, going to school and going to church on Sundays. Saturdays was different. It was set apart. It was dramatically different than the rest of the week. We had time to do different things. And so we have this idea of a set apart day of rest, right? And so we're not supposed to work on those days. We're not supposed to allow our children to work or our servants to work. We are supposed to give even the land rest on those days. And so over time, they start to make what's called the oral Torah. The Torah is the law. The oral Torah is laws given on top of those, rules given on top of the laws, so that we might not ever get anywhere close to the line. So rules are developed over time, and they're aimed to protect the people from breaking God's law, but they deviate. And a word of caution, when we talk about things like this, we need to understand that different rabbis and different traditions had different rules. So when we hear that certain people believed you couldn't do this or you couldn't do that, it's very similar to how you might know Christian folks from different denominations who have different beliefs on different things. It wasn't that all Jews believed this or there was widespread practice. But there were certain things, especially two, that might upset the Pharisees, that might consider them to be unlawful, that they were doing on this day. Have you ever, for health reasons, counted your steps? You have a pedometer, you're like, I got this many steps in today. I got to get my steps in. I got to get to a certain number, right? It was almost the opposite for certain Jews in the first century. There was a cap. You could only walk, ready? 1,999 steps on the Sabbath day. That 2,000th step was too laborsome. It was, again, not that the 2,000th step was like magical, but it was that in their mind, they're like, 2,000 steps is about 0.9 miles. If you're like going out to walk a mile, that's working, right? You're putting in effort. And so we're just going to say, keep it under 1,999 steps. And you're resting, right? Go for a nice half-mile stroll. You're resting. And so they were out walking. And so maybe this was a group that said, like, they're walking too far. They're walking on the Sabbath, right? He wasn't in the synagogue in this setting. He was walking. And the second one, which was pretty self-explanatory, I think, is that they say you can't harvest on the Sabbath. You can't go and get stuff out of the fields. And so they would then possibly believe that picking the grain might be considered harvesting, and yet it's in spirit with Leviticus 23 that says that those foreigners can pick as they go. And so they're accusing Jesus' disciples of working on the Sabbath, of doing more than they ought to, which then in turn means that they're not revering it as holy and by extension God. And so they lobby this concern, this complaint to Jesus to see what he would say. And he answers them, as he so often does, with a question, which Jesus can do, but Katie says I'm not allowed to answer her questions with questions. I don't understand. But verses 25 and 26 says this. He answered, have you ever read what David did when him and his companions were hungry and in need? The days of the high priest, he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. So they ask him a question. They're alarmed. They're concerned. He says, okay, well, have you not read about David? Might sound a little snarky to kind of retort to the teachers of the Old Testament. Well, have you not read the Old Testament? But we need to understand that their initial question was pretty snarky because Jesus clearly understood the Sabbath fully. He understood the Old Testament better than them. He taught the Old Testament when he was 13 in the temple. And so he says, well, okay, well, let me give you an example. You might remember late 90s, early 2000s, there was a big kind of a craze. What would Jesus do? And they had the WWJD bracelets and all that stuff. In the first century Jewish context, the question would be, what would David do? He was the guy, right? Even more so than Moses and Elijah. He was revered. He was the greatest king of the line. And so Jesus points straight to a story of David. And it's one out of 1 Samuel. We're not going to pull it up and dive real deep into it, but 1 Samuel 21 and 22, if you want to read it this week. David was on the run from King Saul, and he came to a priest, and he petitioned him for food. He said, me and my men are weary. We need food. Give me even 5 loaves for all of us if you have it. He replies, I only have consecrated bread that's meant only for priests. But he gives it to David, and he gives it to his men, and they eat it. And so it's a story of the letter of the law being ignored in favor of hospitality and in favor of grace. David by the strictest letter of the law, should not have received that bread, nor any of his men. David, by the strictest letter of the law, should not have asked for that bread, nor should any of his men. And we know from 1 Samuel that one chapter later, the king accuses this priest of colluding with David for giving him the bread. He's not a priest. You're not supposed to give him that bread. But the priest acted in line with the heart of the law, which was to give to those in need. And so Jesus poses this question to them. What about David? David technically broke the letter of your law, but was meeting a need. If I'm out with my disciples on this road and we don't have food and there is food left for us, should we not eat it? Is it the letter of the law or the intention behind the law? And so, again, he usually answers their questions with questions, and they answer his questions with no answers. This is an ongoing theme in Mark. They ask a question, he asks a question back, they say nothing. So they did not respond, and so he says to them, this is kind of the center of this passage, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is God, or is Lord, even on the Sabbath, or even of the Sabbath. So what does this mean? The Sabbath is for man, not man for the Sabbath. Well, at this point in the Jewish teaching, the concept had become, are you resting right? Are you resting right? Only necessary work was permitted. Are you resting correctly? Right? We could get into conversations about things that we find that are restful, right? It's restful for some of us to tidy. It's restful for some of us to cook. Other people are like, ew and ew. Those are not restful for me. It is restful for me to lay absolutely perfectly still on my bed for hours at a time. That's what's restful for me, right? That's what rest is. Some people are like, that sounds boring. Why would you ever do that? But the question is, are you resting right? It seems weird, right? That maybe you'd be just laying in your bed and someone would come in and say, you're doing this wrong. But this is what the law had become. It's a day of rest, and yet we have lots of rules about how you might be resting incorrectly. Again, the intention was good. The Pharisees aren't out here just wicked people like, I'm going to lie to you about God. They're like, we need to make sure we do this right. They had a good intention, but it became twisted over time. And so it became certain laws and certain groups of things like this. First aid only in life-threatening cases. Imagine, if you will, you fall down the stairs and you break your arm. A friend takes you to the hospital and they say, oh, sorry, it's Sunday. Heart attacks and strokes only today. Come back tomorrow. It's not life-threatening, so we can't help you. You cut your hand in your kitchen and you're bleeding profusely and you call 911 and they say, oh, I'm sorry. Doesn't sound like you're going to die. We're not going to send an ambulance. Tomorrow, call back tomorrow. This was, again, an attempt to rest well. They were making these lines about this day is different than every other day. So only if it's life-threatening can you help with first aid. There's no helping of animals of any kind. And I don't know if you ever raised farm animals, but you can't really tell them which day of the week to give birth. And so if you had one giving birth, you could not help, even if it was complicated, even if that meant that it was probably going to kill both of those animals. That would be work. And so you can't do it. Or some of them would say that if you tore a garment, you could sew it for sure, but you can only sew one stitch. Or if you wanted to write a letter to a friend, you could write one for sure, but only one letter. R.C. Sproul says the logic here is maybe one is easy, two is work, I guess. I don't know. One is easy, two is work. There's all these laws, these rules, right? They're designed for you to rest well, but that is making men for Sabbath. It's making us have to work for the Sabbath rather than the Sabbath being for us. It becomes rigid. But it also becomes rules that we can keep that avoids the reason behind God's rules. Rules that we can keep, ones that we can know that we're doing well or not in. I'm taking a class right now in seminary on discipleship, and we're reading through this book talking about practices in the church. And there's a whole chapter in there about rest in the modern culture. And the biggest narrative that the book talks about is this idea that a lot of Christians in this world of efficiency and hurry and getting lots of things done, they feel like they only get rest when they've earned rest. The Sabbath is not earned. The Sabbath is given. We didn't create the world in 6 days and then take a day off. He created the world in 6 days and then he gave it to us because we need rest. And yet sometimes we get into this hamster wheel of life and we think, well, I really can't take some time off. I really can't rest today because I have other things to do. Or maybe you were sick this week and so you already had your day off. You didn't really earn your day off. You have to go keep working. But rest isn't an award, is a reward, not an award. It's not, you don't earn it. You receive it. It's a gift from God. It helps shape your whole life. It's a grace from God. We need rest. Scripture tells us that we need rest. Our kids need rest. The animals need rest. Even the earth needs rest. If you just keep harvesting and keep harvesting and keep harvesting and keep harvesting, keep cutting down trees and keep cutting down trees, it is not an infinite supply of earth. We can destroy it. We have to give it rest. We have to break. But we need to understand that that's because of our finiteness that we need it. God didn't need to rest on the seventh day. He didn't make the world in 6 days and go, whoo, I'm pretty tuckered out. He could have made 10,000 more earths. But he modeled rest. He built rest into the system for us because he knows that we need it. And so Jesus says, Sabbath is for us. Rest is for us. We are not built for rest. Rest is built for us. We don't have to earn it. We don't have to do it right. This is not Sabbath. You don't understand Sabbath. And then he says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Or the NIV says, Lord, even of the Sabbath. Last week, we talked about him making this audacious claim that he was the Son of Man, this mysterious figure from Isaiah who seems like us, looks like a person, but is God and can forgive sins. And he says the Son of Man came with the authority to forgive sins. And he says now the Son of Man is the Lord of Sabbath. So what does it mean that he's the Lord of Sabbath? There was a movie that came out a couple years ago that talked about the lawsuit with the NFL and concussions and brain injuries. And there's a scene, a pretty important scene in the movie where the man who's trying to sue the NFL is basically told they're too big to sue. You don't understand. They own a day of the week. Sunday is theirs. You can't sue them. They're too big. Right? Jesus isn't saying Saturday is mine. I'm in charge of Saturdays. He's not the supervisor of Saturday. He is claiming to be the creator God who gave us the rest. He gave us Sabbath. He knows its purpose because he gave it to us. Every time the teachers of the law ask him, hey, do you know the law? He more or less responds with like, I gave you the law. Hey, do you know about rest? I gave it to you. He is the creator God, the ruler of rest, the giver of it. The one who promises, like we said in our call to worship, to come to me, all who are weary, for I will give you rest. It is his rest to give. And this changes everything. He says, I know about this way more than you do. And so we continue again, weirdly through a chapter break to the next story. And I want to read for you verses 1-6 of chapter 3. And as I do, I want you to just look at this kind of awkward drawing on the board. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled or withered hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal the man on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And so we have a man. We're not in a field in this story. We're in the synagogue. We have a man who's come on the Sabbath to worship, a man who's come to receive help, and he has a withered or a shriveled hand. He has a hand that is causing him problems, that is not doing what it used to do, is not doing what it ought to do. Maybe some of us can identify with this arthritis or an injury or a hand that doesn't do the things that it used to do, doesn't do the things that would make life so much easier on us if it could do. And he's not out in a field. He's there to worship in the synagogue. He's come to hear Jesus, maybe because he's heard that he heals people, or maybe just because he knows this is where help should be found. And when he comes, the teachers of the law, the people who are supposed to be running the synagogue and helping people and leading worship services, they instead are watching to see if this man will receive help so they could be angry that someone came to church for help and got it. So they can be upset that someone came to the temple to get help and receive it. It's a backwards story. Jesus does not hide from them. He doesn't say, let's go in this back room and talk. He says, come up here in front of everyone. I remember growing up in youth group, my youth pastor used to always like to use me to act out stories, bring me up here, everyone's looking at me, and have me do an action or an object lesson. And it was always like, I don't want to be the object lesson, right? This guy who didn't want to be the object lesson get written down in the Gospel of Mark. He definitely didn't want to be Exhibit A for their case they're building against Jesus. He just wanted to be healed. He wanted to be helped. That's why he came to the synagogue. Is this not where the presence of God is? Is this not where the healer, creator, lover God is? Is this not where I come to be helped, to hear good news? And so Jesus asks them, he says, what is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? What do your little rules say? Should we do bad things on the Sabbath? It would be a bad thing to say, I'm sorry, you have not met the threshold. You're not dying, and so I'm not going to help you. To save a life or to kill, because again, he discerns in his heart, he knows that they're plotting to kill him. The people who are supposed to be running the synagogue are conspiring to kill someone in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and they think that helping someone with a crippled hand is sin. He's angry. It says he's angry and deeply distressed. He wants to know why it is that they think that someone who's coming to God to find help is being told, not today, or you don't need help. Your situation's not bad enough. You need to come back when it's life-threatening. You need to come back on another day. I'm sorry, no help can be found for you today. Jesus is making an example here, letting us know that this is not right, that the teachers of the law, they're more or less saying, God would not want me to help you. In fact, God would think it's sinful for me to help you. God would hate that I help you today because it's the Sabbath day. God would hate me showing you love. This is how twisted and distorted these rules placed on top of God's laws have moved things. I have a friend who was invited to speak at a friend's church. And so he went to speak, and it was out of state. He thought it would be kind of cool. I'll see my friend. I'll speak at his church. This will be really fun. So he stayed at a hotel. The church put him up in, and then they said, someone from the church is going to pick you up. We want to make a very personal touch. And so his family comes in a minivan. It's a dad and a mom and a couple of kids, and they pick him up and take him to church. And the dad is a deacon or an elder in the church. I don't quite remember, but they're driving to church, and they're just chatting about stuff. And he said, it's a great morning. And And then we see someone who appears to be a single mom with a flat tire on the side of the road. And as we pass by them, he asked the man driving, "Why are we not stopping?" And he said, "Well, we're going to church." He said, No. Why are we not stopping? As they're driving farther away, he said, "Why are we not turning back and helping that person on the side of the road?" He said, "You don't understand. You're needed at church. And if you're not there, who's going to say the words at the front of the church? It doesn't make any sense." This good and Christian person, a leader in his church, not a wicked person, not a bad person, it didn't register in their mind that person needed help. There was a blind spot there for them. They were like, "I got to get the speaker to the church so we can have the service. And that's the most important thing. And it's worship and it's honoring to God." And my friend, when they got to a red light, told them, like, "Look, I'm either hopping out of the car or you're doing a U-turn. We're going to at least just go make sure someone's on the way. There's a tow truck coming." When they returned back, it turns out it was a woman with a kid in the car seat and a flat tire, a husband who was at work who could not be reached. And so he helped change the tire quickly. He showed up 5 minutes late to church with a smudge on his suit. He was reprimanded for being late. He was not asked to speak at that church ever again. But he said, "I would do it again." And he said, "I don't think that's a wicked church. I don't think their leadership is bad. I don't think they're unchristlike. I think they were just focused on this is what we do today, and they missed an opportunity to help someone." The Pharisees were not acting as leaders in this story because they had this agenda in mind. They missed it. They missed the whole point. Jesus was so furious with them because they were invalidating somebody's problems. They were using them as an object. They were using them as evidence against him when they should have been helping him. And so our one big thing this morning, if we take nothing else away from it, take away this: Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the giver of rest. So as his followers, we should receive his rest and offer it to others. He says, "All who are weary, come to me. I will give you rest. My yoke is easy." He's the Lord of rest. We need to first receive it, not burn ourselves out, not just keep going and keep going and keep going, but also not just say, "Well, I have this thing to do, and so I can't help you. And you look like you're having a hard time, but I'm trying to do something very churchy today." Jesus is the Lord of Sabbath, and that changes things for us. He's the giver of rest, and that changes things for us. We should first receive that rest, and then we should second be looking for opportunities to offer it to other people. And so we ask ourselves, so what? What do we do with it? It would be easy for us to go, "Well, what we don't do is be a Pharisee." We think the Pharisees are the bad guys of the story. Sin is the bad guy of the story. Pharisees are misguided people who were trying to be helpful, but got way wrong. We don't point our finger at other people's practices. I have a friend who I grew up with who tragically passed away, who his family was this great Christian loving family, but his mom would make all the food for Sunday on Saturday night every single weekend. They would fill up all the cars on Saturday so they wouldn't go to the gas station on Sunday. They wouldn't cook on Sunday. And they had all of these rules, and I didn't understand it. And as a teenager, because you're right about everything when you're a teenager, you're like, you don't understand the Bible. But what I didn't understand at the time was that family, they had some rules in place, but they would have stopped on the side of the road to help that person. They would have helped someone who knocked on their door. They would have gone out of their way. They were great and gracious and godly people. And so it's not helpful for us to take this story and to go, "Well, that person's bad or this person's bad," but then rather to be self-critical in light of the truth of Scripture. So we need to ask ourselves, firstly, do we receive the gift of rest from God? What I don't mean is, do you take Saturdays off from work? What I mean is, do you receive the gift of rest from God? The gift of rest that says you don't have to earn it. You don't have to keep turning your wheels. You don't have to follow all of these rules, but to know that in the matter of your week, over the course of your week, God wants you to take some time, spend time with loved ones, do something you enjoy, rest and restore and recuperate yourself that you would not burn out. This might look different for some of you. Some of you have a job that requires you to work on Sundays sometimes. And I know that Some of us have probably had experience with churches where they're like, that's just wrong. Cool. Give them a job then. I don't know what to tell you outside of sometimes people have to work on Sundays, right? I'm a pastor. I'll tell you, this is not my day of rest. This is not my day of rest. I was up at 6 this morning doing the final edit and read through of this sermon. This is not my day of rest. But we have to find a day of rest. We have to find a time of rest, and we need to lean into the rest that God gives us. Because what good is it to have a Savior and a Lord if we're still trying to do it all ourselves? We misunderstand the situation. So the other thing is that we need to understand, are we creating imaginary lines that are easier to follow than God's ways? Are we saying things like, well, I want to see my family on Christmas, but if it was just 3 hours of driving rather than 5, we could do that. If it was 2 hours of driving rather than 5, then, because Christmas and driving, or do we stop saying these are imaginary lines that we're making up? Some of these lines that we put in place were there for a good reason at the time. We thought, hey, this is a boundary for me. But maybe we go back and we reassess those boundaries. Are we making imaginary lines that are holding us back from being helpful and following God's way, not just the letter of a law? And the last one, this is what I want us to really think on this morning and this week. What shriveled hands do we ignore? What blind spots? What car on the side of the road because we're going somewhere and where we're going is important? Right? I honestly believe that nothing in this text tells us that those Pharisees hated that man. They didn't see that man. They were caught up in something else. They didn't see his hurt. We get preoccupied. We get busy. We get going and going and going and going. And if you're like me, you get to the end of the day and you still have stuff on your to-do list, you're mad. You're like, I didn't get it all done today, and I got to do it tomorrow. And we get up. We talked about this a few weeks ago with the quote from C.S. Lewis, where C.S. Lewis says the biggest problem with modern Christianity is that the moment we wake up, we impose ourselves upon the day. We have to get stuff done. What blind spots do you have? And would you be willing to hear a trusted brother or sister in Christ tell you that they think you have one? Hey, I think maybe you have a blind spot here. Hey, I think maybe you're just kind of breezing by this situation. Hey, I think maybe you could be helpful here. And so if we are to receive rest and extend rest, beloved of God, oftentimes giving someone else rest is going to be from co-laboring with them, which might mean sacrificing a bit of rest or sacrificing a bit of our productivity and our time to extend that rest of God to them. And so if we are followers of Christ, if that's what we set out to be, living into his new kingdom, and he is the Lord of the Sabbath, the ruler of rest, then we should be people of rest, and we should be people who look to extend rest and people who go, ooh, I missed an opportunity to do that. He is the Lord of Sabbath, and that changes everything. Will you pray with me?